we've maintained a rich and vibrant culture and a connection and a way of life that we currently live today that has thrived for many years, going forward. So you think about that lack of non-involvement, the importance of co-management and how we can introduce exactly what I just introduced to you to the students in the classroom. That's invaluable.
Welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I have been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care. Well, David, I'm really excited to welcome you to the Co-Management Commons podcast, and really excited about the collaboration that we've started. And for listeners who don't know, myself and David and a colleague that you'll hear shortly, Kiri, both from the Yukon, we're going to be collaborating on some special episodes with guests from the Yukon. And one of the things that makes me so excited about this is I know when I first ever started reading about co-management, it seemed like that's where everything was happening, was in the Yukon. I guess a lot of academics were writing stuff, and all of the early lessons seem to be coming out of your territory, and I haven't read as much lately, so I'm really excited to get more up to date again. And personally, I feel like we all have to keep advocating for co-management, so it'll be really interesting to hear the views of the different guests that you have lined up. And before we get too far into that part of the conversation, I guess maybe we could all introduce ourselves, and maybe start with you, David. You could just share a little bit about who you are.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jamie. My name is David Silas. I am a part of the Wolf Clan. I am from Selkirk First Nation, which is a nation centralized here in the Yukon, about 3 hours north of Whitehorse, kind of smack dab in between Whitehorse and Dawson City. A majority of my life, I grew up in my community. I was taken away at a very young age, and I think that's also an important aspect of who I am, and really talking about kind of, where I'm coming from. So, as a part of the 60s group, I was taken away from my community, and I ended up in the care of Catholic Social Services. Like many of us Indigenous children during that time in the 80s, it was a very volatile time for us, where many of us were taken away and put into the child welfare system. So during that time, growing up out of my community, it was very important for me to try to understand kind of the new world that I was growing up in. After my high school years, I eventually made my way back to the community. There was some effort in that, right? There was some advocacy work on Yukon side to really get some of the children that were taken away during that time kind of reintegrated back into the community. So I was, one of those lucky ones, if I can say that, right? And I think that's one of the key aspects of who I am. And I've really tried over the years to really incorporate that into my introduction, because it's really important that I think that people understand not only the history of Yukon First Nations, but also kind of the realities and the lived experience that many of us do have. And, through that lived experience, we bring that into kind of, opportunities for us to share, right? I'm in the unique position now with Yukon University, in which I get to not only share my lived experience, but also kind of mentor and really help to grow that next generation of learners that are interested in the field of Indigenous governance, to really understand and to really incorporate some of that true history, that lived history that many of us have experienced, whether it be through residential school, the 60s group, which is the group home system for myself, but the other aspects of things, right? And, through this podcast, what I'm really hoping to do is to build awareness and to talk more about some of the challenges, but also talk about, some of the good stuff that has really been accomplished over the years. As you mentioned, Yukon First Nations have really blazed the trails when it comes to looking at what we can actually do and really achieve within this world of comprehensive modern land claims. And it's really interesting to see what we've been able to do within the Yukon under the co-management. I'm trying to be very careful of the word regime, because it's one of those loaded words, right? So the co-management regime in the Yukon talks a little bit about a hierarchy or, kind of occupying the field from a higher form of government, if you will. But in the Yukon, where we are on an equal playing field, and that hasn't always been the case, right? We worked very hard throughout the years. My past leaders, my past elders had to spend countless hours to build a better future for myself and for my children. Throughout the podcast, we'll talk a little bit about the document of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, which is the catalyst of change for us here in the Yukon. It's been dubbed a grievance document that was presented to then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. But I would like to see it more as a Yukon First Nations collective positionality statement. So thinking about that going forward is something that we hope to cover, Jamie. So thank you.
No, that's excellent. And I'm curious to ask you also what led you to the Yukon University, but maybe we'll introduce Kiri quickly as well and let her explain what her role in the project is. And also very grateful, Kiri, for you coming on to the Co-Management podcast in the first season. You were one of the very first guests, and I often get lots of nice comments about our conversation last year. Tell everybody what you're going to be doing to help us out now over this special episode series we're putting together.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, like you said, Jamie, I'm a big podcast fan. So in my head, I will be referring to myself as a podcast producer over the course of these conversations. I think realistically, it's more of like a herding the cats role, just trying to brainstorm different guests, get everyone in the same room at the same time, working across different time zones. And I think it's going to be really fun. I think in my work as a consultant, I get to be very fortunate to be in the same room as a lot of really interesting people. And this just seems like a great opportunity to have more conversations with interesting people.
Thanks for that, Kiri. And as we make our way through all of these podcasts, don't be afraid to jump in from time to time and let us know what we've forgotten or if there's interesting questions that would be helpful. But yeah, David, I was really interested to learn sort of what led you to academia in particular in the School of Indigenous Governance at Yukon.
Hey, yeah. Oh, wow. That's my educational journey in itself was quite the undertaking, I would say, coming from a rural community such as Pelly Crossing with limited to no opportunity. The educational qualities were not the same, if you will, for the high school standards. Coming out of my school in Pelly did not really keep me on the same level as the graduates from, let's say, F.H. Collins here in Whitehorse. So, thinking about opportunities going forward in post-secondary, it was something that I never thought was a reality at first. But then come along the Minto mine, right? What a change for my community, right? The Minto mine was an operating copper mine within what's called Category A lands of my First Nation. The Category A lands is quite significant. It's a significant marker for the mine itself because under our final agreements, there are different categories of lands that are designated within our final agreement itself, which is a land-based agreement, mind you, right? So the final agreement, the Selkirk First Nation final agreement is a land-based agreement. It is separate from the self-government agreement. We could talk about that later on. But the land claims agreement itself was an agreement for land. It was primarily based on Yukon First Nations maintaining a land base so that we can start building up kind of a monetary base for ourselves, our own economic development, our own economic growth. Having that opportunity. So the different designation of lands, Category A, for example, means that my First Nation, the Selkirk First Nation, we own the mineral rights, and we also own the surface rights. So it's not the same as fee simple or anything along with other land designations that we have within Yukon. We own pretty much everything down to the center of the earth, and I also believe that there's some airspace obligations too within the Category A settlement lands. Category B, however, is just the surface. So we own the surface rights, but we don't maintain the mineral right. But under our final agreements, we do have chapters that address what's called access to those minerals. So there is some processes in place that maintain our control over those resources, if you will. We have what's called sea lands and site specifics, and those are primarily just for things like traditional hunting grounds or cabins or for fishing areas. The sea lands themselves are our community blocks, so they're the community lands of Pelly Crossing. When the Minto mine came about, it was a Category A mine, meaning that they were going to mine the mineral that we as Selkirk people owned. That changed everything. from royalties to taxations to business opportunities to employment to in training, everything, right? We had to be involved. We were the landowner, we were the mineral owner of the property, and the company just had the right to mine that mineral. So, just understanding that dynamic itself was quite the challenge for my people. Coming from Pelly Crossing, we're historically a very traditional nomadic people that lived off the land. We traveled by the seasons. We fished and we harvested the game that was in season during that time. We picked our traditional medicines. So we lived a very traditional and cultural lifestyle. And coming into the business world, if you will, and being actively involved in something like an operating mine was quite the challenge. And I saw that. I really did. Even as a young person, I saw that disconnect between my people and what was actually occurring with community meetings and how rapid things were going with permitting and not really understanding, right, the true impacts of that mine on our culture, our way of life, on the environment, on everything that we relied on as Selkirk people. So thinking about that, even as a young person, I knew that I needed to do something, right? Coming back to my community at a very young age, I kind of strived towards finding my place. My elders always told me to find your place, whether it's within our pillars of caring, sharing, teaching, and respect. Try to find and understand where you fit and where you belong within our people. And that was my advice, right? So, of course, thinking about where I came from and some of the struggles that I faced with language and culture, that obviously these barriers were put in front of me, being taken away as part of the 60s group, I did not really see myself as somebody that would be kind of a traditional leader, if you will. I knew that I was walking in two worlds. I knew that I had a two-eyed seeing vision of what was actually occurring out in the world and also with the possibilities around economic development. So what I wanted to do was to really pursue science. My elders said that we have enough teachers, we have enough social workers, we have enough lawyers, but we don't have enough people leading the sciences that we need to be done. We don't have our own people leading the research that we need to get done, to assure that we have our values, our principles incorporated into the process, our voices are actively heard. We're a part of the co-management of the mine itself. So I really took it upon myself to gain a better education when it came to environmental monitoring and becoming an environmental technician. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, with the limitations of my education coming from a rural community in Yukon, I was set back. So a long story short, I did retain my Bachelor of Science with the University of Alberta, but it took me 6 years to do that. Again, speaking to that inequality of education from our rural communities and our First Nation schools, really kind of put that as I don't want to say a barrier, but just another layer of challenges, if you will. So I had to go back and I really had to do, the upgrading and essentially had to do my grade 10, my grade 12, and grade 11 just to obtain a 4-year degree. It was a little bit of a setback, but I think it was really important for me because I really got to learn about that key transition, right, from the rural communities into your university city lifestyle, if you will. I had a chance to really address that form of culture shock. It really is, right? For a lot of our youth coming out of our communities, like living the lifestyle that I just talked about off the land, harvesting and collecting wild game and wild animals, to be subjected into an academic institute like our universities and how they're currently situated is scary for them, right? And, it's something that we're consistently working on at the university right now. We do see it as an opportunity for us to really connect and engage with our communities in a meaningful way, to see how we can start encouraging some of our youth to start seeing value, right, and coming to post-secondary. So for me, I decided to take that on. But also at that time, my wife was also pursuing her social work degree. So yeah, that kind of was a team effort, if you will, right? She would go and pursue her social work and I would do my environmental sciences. Yeah, that's kind of how we got started at the university. But when it came to Indigenous governance, I really got active in Indigenous research methodology and starting to really work with our Yukon First Nations to really build a basis of involvement for them, to have them more inclusively involved, not only with their knowledge, but also within participation and understanding of the research process, working towards, at that time, what's called research agendas, and really getting an idea of what they're interested in and really tailoring that to the university curriculum that was being developed at that time, to really start looking at ways that we can start developing the next generation of Indigenous researchers in the North. So that was my job primarily for many years. I sat at the Yukon Research Center since 2015. So I would say about 6 or 7 years, I continuously worked on different aspects of engagement. And in the Yukon, the dynamics around our communities is so prevalent, especially when it comes to things like research engagement. There is no one model, right? There is no one way that we can paint what's occurring down in Watson Lake to what's occurring up in Oak Crow. Every one of our nations are in different positions and in different situations when it comes to, how their communities are growing, what's important to them. Also with the advancement of our final and land-claims agreements, the implementation aspect of things is a lot different for many communities. Some are really working towards advancing, language and culture. Other First Nations see value in justice, and others are seeing a lot of value in health of their community and health of their citizens, and others are seeing value in education. So there are different areas that our First Nations are currently occupying and taking those responsibilities away from the federal government. And that's one of the things that we do have here in the Yukon under the agreements that we do have. So getting into the classroom, I really started to see the need, the drive, the push, if you will. I've given many conference presentations. I've had an opportunity to stand up in many classrooms. I've had an opportunity to co-teach, and it really felt good, right? It felt like where I needed to be. As my elders said, find your place. I felt like I really did find my place when I was in that classroom. I had an opportunity to join the IGD program. I jumped on it. Things were not really going great at the research center during that time. Things had really slowed down in the world of research post-COVID. That really interrupted, the momentum, if you will, that we had with our communities when it came to community engagement and northern research on how we can better involve our First Nation communities. Dr. Ken Coates provided me with an offer I couldn't refuse, if you will. And I really jumped on it. And it's been over a year and a half now that I've been with the IGD program. I've got 2 full semesters of core courses that I do teach within the IGD program. I have a unique opportunity to meet the new incoming students, the young ones. So I have an opportunity to connect with them at their early stages as possible within their first year, and to really show them that there is a place for them within the university, right? And to really encourage that sense of place for them. So I get to do that at the beginning of the stage with the new incoming students. And then I also work with the students that are graduating that year. So I get to help them with their big capstone project and really focus on, what's important for them and to really for them to demonstrate what they've learned throughout the IGD program. So yeah, that's kind of how I got there.
If I could just jump in, it's interesting what you were saying, David, about how you got into science. You hearing your elders say we need more scientists, we need more researchers, and some of the work you've done in community engagement around research. Really, to bring this back to what you said earlier, kind of full circle, is the piecing together today for our children tomorrow about research, which is all about exactly what you're saying. And it's all about research needs to work for our communities. It's not going to do us any, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something along the lines of it's not going to do us any good if it's sitting on a shelf. Exactly. Yes. And so I really hear that in the direction that you've taken. Given that you opened the discussion talking about Together Today, it kind of brings it back full circle. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention too, I'll never forget a few years back, I was at one of the Yukon U graduations, and it was nothing like I'd ever seen before. There was just so much pride and a huge celebration that I could see how impactful people like yourself are going to be in contributing to that program. And one of the reasons I started the Co-Management Commons actually was wanting to create more open educational resources about co-management so educators could teach about co-management in the classroom. And I wonder if you've thought about that a little bit, of how you might be able to use the podcast now when the recordings are done and how you'll use it in the classroom with a lot of the students.
So as I mentioned, one of the core courses that I do teach with the Indigenous Governance Degree program here at Yukon University is the Intro to Governance. I can definitely see this being a part of the curriculum, a part of the learning journey for the students to get a better understanding of the components of co-management. When we introduce co-management within the Yukon context, we think a lot about this lack of non-involvement, right? There's a history of non-involvement. You start, the gold rush, 1898, even prior to that, right? 1898, 40,000 stampeders came into the Yukon Territory. The amount of impacts that occurred during that time, no one asked, right? No one talked to any First Nation chief or leader about, what they thought about that particular point of time. We fast forward a little bit to the building of the Alaska Highway, the same thing, right? This big push of a highway right through central Yukon, many traditional territories interrupted, many First Nations impacted. At that time, they were giving hunting licenses away for $1, right? You've heard of biological warfare before, especially down with the Plains Crees Indians, in which they decimated the buffalo population. Maybe something like that was happening during that time too, when they were giving away a dollar hunting license for big game animals, right? So the military people at that time were blasting away and destroying game as they were building that road. When you think about, the creation of the Kluane National Park and the major impacts that park had on the Southern Shoshone people, the Kluane and the Champagne and Ajax people, nobody talked to them, right? Nobody asked them. Nobody thought that would be an important thing to address with them, right? There's a history within that park that connects those people to that area for millennia. And nobody decided and thought it'd be interesting or important for them to be involved in that aspect of things. You go up to the 60s, you think about the Faro mine, Mount Manson, these huge environmental disasters that Canada will now have to deal with. I can't even fathom to think that my great-great-great-grandchildren will be testing groundwater at the Faro mine. There's going to be groundwater testing for 500 years within that mine itself, right? It's crazy. And again, that creation of that mine, these environmental disasters that are currently existing, that are quite frankly in the backyard of the Ross River Dene, in the backyard of the Little Salmon Carmacks people, in the backyard of the Han people up in Dawson. Nobody talked to them, right? Then we continue on with this lack of non-involvement for Yukon First Nations people, right? And then you come to the Mackenzie pipeline discussion and the impacts of that onto the Gwich'in. No more, Elijah said, right? No more. So there needs to be a better way forward. There needs to be something done to assure that we as First Nations people are involved, that we have a voice, that there's a requirement for people to talk to us before these major developments do occur and happen within our traditional territories. So if you think about what occurred back in the 1968 white paper and everything else that led up to the Yukon First Nations making that journey back in 1973, right? Without them making that effort, who knows where we would be today as Yukon First Nations people. It's not like today, right? It's not like we can just get on a plane or a flight to Ottawa and, have a nice meal along the way. This was a journey, an arduous, long journey for these chiefs to go down and to represent our interests, right? And I'm honored to be here today as a child of tomorrow. Through that document, I see myself. I'm represented in that document. I'm who they were talking about, essentially, back in 1973. So Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow really laid out, the importance of exactly that. Yukon First Nations have not been involved actively in the creation or the development of the Yukon. And we've always been here. We've never lost any wars with Canada. We've never signed any treaties in Canada. We're not a part of the number treaty system within Canada. You think about the colonial impacts from east to west. My people, the Northern Shoshone people on the banks of the Yukon and Pelly rivers, were probably one of the last people to be contacted. You think about Schwadka back in 1840, I think was the first white person to come down and to meet my people, 1840. Now you think about the amount of wars and everything else that the people in the eastern parts of Canada have fought with the British and the French and other colonial interests within the fur trade itself. My people, first contact, maybe 1840. It's amazing to think about how rich and vibrant that culture is. We've maintained a rich and vibrant culture and a connection and a way of life that we currently live today that has thrived for many years, going forward. So you think about that lack of non-involvement, the importance of co-management and how we can introduce exactly what I just introduced to you to the students in the classroom. That's invaluable.
You are listening to a special Yukon edition of the Co-Management Commons podcast supported by Yukon University and UArctic. The podcast is produced by Cloudberry Connections and hosted by Jamie Snook in collaboration with Kiri Staples and David Silas. Enjoy the rest of the conversation and thank you for caring about Indigenous co-management and honoring our treaties.
I guess given all of that context and history, I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on the concept of co-management and how you feel about it, because I know in the literature and talking to a lot of different people, there's a mixed range of views about co-management. So just curious, as we interview a number of people now going forward, if you'll have any of your own thoughts about co-management.
By means, I am no expert in the field. I was not one of the ones negotiating, the land claims agreements. I was not a lawyer like Dave sitting there with our past elders talking about ways of documenting their vision in a meaningful way that'll really produce a productive governance system here in the Yukon. I just want to put that forth. But I listen, right? And I've taken the time to really listen to those that have been there and have really taken the time to negotiate, the agreements that we do have right now, to work with the communities in a way that they did in an open and honest fashion, and understanding where all of that is coming from, and to see where it is today is a little bit of a letdown, if you will. I feel quite disappointed in where we've gotten when it comes to our involvement in co-management. We have such a huge responsibility, within our umbrella final agreements. Just to list off a few of the boards that we actively involved in, thinking about the Caribou Management Board, we're actively involved in the Fish and Wildlife Management of the Yukon, where we're actively involved in the environmental assessment and the licensing of environmental projects in the Yukon, where we're actively involved in the licensing of water licenses. So we have a vast responsibility as Yukon First Nations people to be a part of these boards and committees in a meaningful way. A majority of them are kind of, I guess they'd be kind of a tripartite, right? Where there's 3 different levels of government involved. So in the Yukon, there's a seat for Yukon First Nations, there's a seat for the Yukon Territorial Government, and then there's also a seat for the federal representative. There's always representation within our final agreement for the rest of Canada, for Canadians. It's not a line drawn in the sand, right? Our final agreements is not that binary, if you will. It's not us and them. It's not over there, over here. There's a lot more to it than that, right? We're very inclusive through our agreements for the rest of Canada to enjoy Canada as a whole. We understand that we are part of Canada. We are not a separate state or a nation, right? So we have an active relationship. And we hear that even from our prime ministers, right? Justin Trudeau, when he got elected, right? I want to build a nation-to-nation relationship with our First Nations in Canada. There's a lot behind that too, right? This word reconciliation we hear a lot right now. It's a little bit different here in the north. How you reconcile with the Algonquin people in the eastern Canada is a little bit different than how you reconcile with northern Shoshone people in central Yukon. And that's due to the history. That's due to the history of colonialism, the impacts of the fur trade, et cetera, the treaty system and other governance across the board. But when I think about co-management going forward, and again, we heard that with Pierre Poilievre, this nation to nation. He was yesterday, I believe, he was meeting with the AFM, the Assembly of First Nations in Calgary, Alberta. And he said that too. I want to build a nation to nation relationship, right? So here we are, 8 years later, the same tone, the same approach, right? So how can we advance that? How can we work on that, a little bit better and start thinking about co-management? Recently, I had an elder that's actively involved, Judy Gingell. She went down in 1973 with the elders and with the leaders for Together to Eat for Our Children Tomorrow. Judy is really concerned about the state of co-management in the Yukon, if you will, and our roles on boards and committees, which is so important to have, that active voice for us as First Nations that hasn't been there, that hasn't been present in the past. So when you think about our roles and, we have this seat available to us, right? As I mentioned, we have a seat available at the table now. We can utilize that seat in a good way, but it's tough to say this, but it's sometimes it's the lack of understanding and knowing about the agreements. It's pretty much now we are just having, I guess, kind of, the position is being filled because there's a position to be filled. We are losing our voice when it comes to co-management. We are not as active as we were on these boards and committees. And if I can use the words of Judy Gingell, we as Yukon First Nations people, we're missing out because we are not as active as we used to be. There is a different generation that is actively representing us on these boards and committees. And, their agenda is not the same agenda as, our past leaders. So there's kind of a disconnect there that has occurred somewhere along the line. And it's going to take people like myself to address, that disconnect and to really start talking about promoting our active voice on boards and committees, and not to be there as a figurehead and to fill a position, but to understand that you're there to represent Yukon First Nations people. You're there to represent a history. You're there to represent a voice of a community. You're there to represent, the traditions and values of all of 14 nations, of all 8 language groups. I think there's a disconnect between that understanding. And it's unfortunate to see, but, thankfully, I think there's the will of people like myself that are willing to take on that challenge and to really try to promote, more activism, if you will, amongst our people on these boards and committees.
And I think through all of the discussions that we'll have now in the days ahead, there'll certainly be more awareness, hopefully brought to the documents like Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow and the umbrella agreements. So hopefully that can be one outcome of doing a podcast like this, just so people, even more broadly in Canada, are familiar with the importance of these documents. And I wonder, Kiri and David, with the list that you shared with me, I was really excited by the names and their backgrounds. If you'd like to give a little bit of an overview of some of the people that we hope to speak to, if not by name, by sort of their position and involvement, just to give listeners some insight in who we're hoping to talk to in the days ahead.
Yeah, well, when we were talking as a group about, I think, kind of the stories that we wanted to highlight and discuss on this podcast series, a few things came to mind. I think, David, you've done a good job of introducing these themes, but one is just the vision of co-management in the UFA and the Umbrella Final Agreement, in Together Today, and all of the individual final and self-government agreements. Like, what was the vision there? And I think we're fortunate in that we still have a lot of folks who were involved in the negotiation. You mentioned Judy Gingell. She's still around and, is a really powerful voice. So I think trying to talk to some of those people who were involved in the creation of these agreements and what the vision was for those agreements in terms of the vision for co-management. I think that's one story that I think will come up a lot. And then as well as some of the challenges that are faced. You mentioned those as well, David. A couple other interesting perspectives that I think will come out of this series is about the different types of co-management that we have in Yukon. We have renewable resource councils, which I think in the Yukon are often dismissed because they don't necessarily have the same name or strength behind them. But there are incredible things that renewable resource councils are doing, and really innovative things, working with the limited resources that they have to do really important work. So that's at the community level. As you mentioned, we have the Porcupine Caribou Board. We have some of these other caribou co-management councils and committees, et cetera. You listed a number of the Ecofish and Wildlife Management Board. There's all these different co-management institutions that are working in the Yukon. But I think the other thing that came up in our conversation when we were talking about this podcast series was whether there is an opportunity to talk about co-management from different perspectives, not just about lands and animals. Maybe we can have a conversation about co-management in education. What does that look like? So I think there's some really interesting opportunities here, and to highlight all of those different conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. In Yukon, with the First Nations School Board, a very unique structure that we do have, in which they've taken control of some of our rural schools in our communities, and it'd be really interesting to hear about kind of that relationship and how that's operating and how that's working. Another, not too much with the land stuff again, but with the Land Use Planning Council itself, and thinking about the Peel watershed, right? And what's the point of being a part of a co-management regime when you're just going to end up in court anyway, right? So, you think about that thing, that aspect. Is it just a waste of time if you're just going to end up in court? Is that kind of, so hearing about that perspective would be very interesting, from somebody from National Dun or from Oak Crow or from CH. Would be also really good. But with the education aspect of things, the education directorate itself and how they're actively involved, they're frontline workers now, right? The education directorate itself, the workers are in the schools working with the students from early on, right? From elementary right to high school, right? So they're there supporting them, advocating for them. And I think that's one of the cool aspects of that particular department is the advocating for the Indigenous student, giving them a voice, providing them with a different avenue, if you will, to talk about some of their challenges and some of their struggles with education. It's important.
Another side note, I guess, David, I was curious to ask you, because I know on a lot of your online things, it mentions that you're pretty passionate about harvesting as well. And I was kind of curious what that included. What things were you into there?
Oh, I'm a big game harvester.
Okay.
I love to get out and to primarily hunt moose. I'm a moose hunter. When we can fish for salmon. That's also something that I love to do with my family, is just to get out to that new classroom, if you will, right? And to have an opportunity for not only for me to learn from those with me, but also for me to teach. Because within my culture, the Northern Shoshone people, we have a system of learning and sharing. We don't learn from our parents primarily, right? Our parents, they do have a role in our lives, obviously, but when it comes to traditional teachings, that was primarily done by our aunties and our uncles, right? So, looking at a system of governance and teaching within the Northern Shoshone people, I'm of the age now where I'm considered an uncle, which I'm very proud of, right? For my own citizens, for my youth, right? So when I do go out hunting, I make sure that I do have, some youth with me. I enjoy showing them how to prep the moose to harvest and to care for the moose. We also talk about our dually laws, right? When we're out there, how we as Northern Shoshone people conduct ourselves around a kill. We don't say things are gross and disgusting. We don't disrespect the animal in any way. There are certain protocols that we do while we're harvesting the animal that I really enjoy teaching and sharing with the young people. That's something that when you come of age, I guess, and you have that opportunity to teach. It's a part of one of our primary pillars that we do have within our community of the values that we share, right? So caring, sharing, teaching, and respect. So not only am I in a unique position as an uncle to teach traditional values and what I know, right, to the younger generation, but I'm also in the classroom, right, as a teacher. So which is really cool and really kind of relates back to that principle of teaching and having that opportunity. But yeah, I'm upriver. I love to go upriver. I'm a river hunter. I love to get on my boat. I love whether it's a day trip or a week trip. I'm all for it, right? We're not out there to go out there on a vacation, having a hard time and the weather and everything else is all a part of the challenge and the journey, and I thoroughly enjoy it. I love it. There's no other place that I'd rather be than out on the land. It's very grounding for me. It's some place that, as I said, being disconnected so long as a 60 school person, having that opportunity to get back, right, and to give back is something that I very cherished. I thoroughly look forward to every year. I don't hunt bear. I don't hunt other aspects of things. We have a strong connection and relationship with some of the animals, and I don't bother bears. So I leave them alone, they leave me alone type of an approach, right? So
that's probably the best way. I just want to say that I'm super excited about the conversations that we're going to have in the next little while, and just really grateful that you were interested, David, and you, Kiri, and how everything's coming together to make this possible, to get some funding and to be able to make this work. So hopefully having these cross-country dialogues like this, there will be learning there for everybody. And that's been one of my greatest joys of this idea of podcasting, because you just keep learning stuff through every single conversation. It's been a great form of professional development, I find, because, I work in co-management too, so it's also so interesting. Some friends have told me the podcast is really nice and helps them get to sleep at night, but I find it really interesting. Others may, I guess you got to be into this stuff. But I don't know if you had any sort of final comments or thoughts before our first guest.
No, I'm also, super excited. I feel that we're just kind of, scratching the surface here. There's so much to talk about, Jamie. There's, I held back quite a bit within this little bit, and I've really tried to stick handle through my words and to really not to go down a rabbit hole too much, but I'm really looking forward to seeing where this takes us, right? As we have the guests come in, generating and building new knowledge, right? This co-creation of knowledge is going to be great. And I'm really looking forward to, to seeing how we can utilize this not only in the classroom, but also, kind of support the next generation of co-managers, right? And I think that's why I'm here. And that's what I want to do. And I really want to promote, the importance of that. Here in the Yukon, under our final agreements, our citizens have a unique opportunity to have a pretty good life being involved in boards and committees. There's a really good opportunity for a lot of our citizens to see a career in being involved in co-management of all the things that we just talked about, and to really, support the initiatives and the implementation and the growth of our communities, or our final agreements, and more importantly, our self-government agreements, right? We never talk a lot about the self-government agreement, but it's the recognition of our rights, right, as Aboriginal peoples. And the self-government agreements recognizes my rights to harvest, to language, to education. It really separates us from, we're not Indian Act Indians up here. And I think that's one of the key messages, one of the attractive themes, if you will, for some of the others across Canada to understand, how do you guys operate not being Indian Act Indians? Well, we'll show them. Hey, Jamie?
Exactly. Thanks again, both, and good luck hurting people, I guess, Kiri was the word you used earlier. And hopefully it's not too hard over the summer. I know people got other things to be doing, obviously. So hopefully we'll have some luck, and I'm super excited for our next conversation. So take care, and we'll be talking again really soon.
Sounds good. Except we won't be talking in the fall because that's when David will be moose hunting.
Absolutely, yeah. But my little one's starting school too, right? So I'm going to really juggle this year.
Yeah.
So I got a little one, grade 5. I mean, she's 5 years old, just starting kindergarten.
Oh,
so and my wife works full time. So I got to figure out some ways of starting earlier and finishing at a time where I can get back to pick her up after and bring her home.
Yeah, it ends early. It's like 3 o'clock.
It does, yeah. So it ends at 3. So I got to make sure that I'm there to pick her up at 3.
Yeah.
And then I can probably pull a couple of hours in my office at work or something like that.
Yeah.
Got to make it work. So,
yeah.
And then with the hunting in between, it's been a while since I've gotten an early September moose, Jamie.
Mm.
So my moose usually comes the 3rd week of September. But if I do get an early moose, then, things will be a lot smoother. So wish me luck on that one.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
I would love to get one.
Are people getting salmon there right now? It's
we have our sonar in the water, so probably as a part of the co-management, right? Again, of our salmon in our community, we have an active partnership in which we oversee a sonar within the Pelly River. And the numbers are looking pretty good. I'm pretty surprised at the numbers. Nobody's fishing, mind you. We do have permission, which we don't need it, but we are honoring the fact that we can harvest for ceremonial purposes. So if we need salmon for a potlatch or something along those lines, we can throw a net in the water for a couple of days or something like that. But our individual fish camps are not fishing right now. We're letting them go by, and I think we've all agreed, again, on the co-management of the Intertribal Watershed Program or the Salmon Subcommittee. But all of the First Nations and all of the users along the Yukon River from the Bering Sea, I believe, from the inlet right out to where here in the Yukon, have all agreed there's a moratorium, I believe, for 7 years now. So no fishing for 7 years for subsistence or for commercial use on the Yukon River. So I'm hoping to see, the numbers do come back. We've seen it in the Fraser, right? The Fraser sockeye.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some good news stories out there. So hopefully we'll have the same with our Chinook salmon run here in the Yukon. But unfortunately, we're getting a different salmon. We get Taku River salmon. So my First Nation buys, I would say, an X amount of salmon that we deliver to each one of our fish camps along the Pelly River. Again, to promote that our principles of caring, sharing, and teaching, we need to still have that classroom, right? We need to still have those aunties and uncle teachings occurring. And it's at these fish camps and at these harvesting camps where they truly happen. So recognizing that, we're getting Taku River salmon brought in. And you can't dry it the same way, right? They're a little bit more of an oilier fish. So the Taku River salmon is more of a canning fish, I believe. You jar it. Mm-hmm. You can't really dry it. It's too oily. So it doesn't really dry the same. So there's, we're mitigating and hopefully we'll adapt, right? But these are mitigative approaches that seems to really still facilitate that opportunity for us to have that traditional classroom, which I'm very thankful for.
All right, you guys take care.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. Please like the podcast, subscribe, and leave comments so we can connect. If you are interested in joining a dedicated Indigenous community of practice with many of Canada's leading practitioners and thinkers in this area, you can skip over and visit our website at www.co-management.ca. Getting signed up is easy, and professional development is a tangible and effective way to show your commitment to reconciliation.